Dr. King, is in principle number one is nonviolence. Nonviolence is the way of life for courageous people, and it takes so much dedication and just strength to put yourself in positions that you know could be potentially dangerous, but in doing it for the good of the many, right? And making it so that we can focus on what can happen for the common good. But it takes people to be able to make those choices and put themselves in those positions. And not everyone's able to make those positions or make the choices to be in those positions. And that doesn't make them any less important in the movement. You know, there's I'll always remember it from the trip that we took most recently. One of the foot soldiers was around the table during the beloved community dinner that we had. And she made this analogy about a jigsaw puzzle. And I always draw a reference to it whenever there's a conversation about individual power and the necessity to lend that power to the movement. Because she said, movements are like jigsaw puzzles, right? We all are our own separate piece. And you may think that you're not important when you're in a box with all the other pieces. But when that puzzle is put together and you're the only piece that's not missing, or that's missing, you become the most important piece in the puzzle. And it's like, wow, that was such a fantastic visualization of how something that can seem really small can play the biggest role in the overarching movement.
Right.
Yeah.
No one's too small.
Nope, no one's too small, too old, or too abled or unabled, right? Everyone can make a difference.
Yep.
Yeah. I was actually having a conversation with a family friend recently, and he was talking about Ferguson and how during the protests they provided a space where folks would come in who were like energy healers, like Qigong, Tai Chi, and massage therapists, and they provided a space where it was just that. So, people were organizing, and then they would come to this space and just, help decompress and release from like all the stress, because it's a very high intensity environment, and then it actually came about because we were talking about like privilege, and then because I feel like some people have the sentiment, well, if you have this privilege you have to use it, and so like if you're, for example, like if you're a white male, you have to be on the front lines and you have to be arrested, but it's not everyone's it's not necessarily like everyone's role to be doing that. It's not everyone's role to be organizing like the specific things about the movement, because if you're doing that and you're not actually fully invested, if that's not what's really calling you, then you can be taking up space for that like another person who is like called to that. You could be taking up space from them, and then also you can, like potentially end up causing more damage if you're not really fully invested in it. So it's like another thing that I learned from the Selma trip was being your whole self, and being your whole self in the movement, because then you can really bring like all of your skills to the table, and be like very like fully invested in it. So I guess that kind of leads me to the question of like, what types of skills or like characteristics do you feel that the youth brought to the movement?
Well, there was energy, and although I was scared, very scared, I was also young, and there's a certain I don't want to make super generalizations here, but that the kind of strength that comes with being on the young side of things can be very helpful. Though what I saw in Alabama was young people, black and white, Latino, Latina, etc. But when they were working with the black churches and with people in the black community, they were working with the elders. Always. I mean, so it wasn't a youth movement, and it wasn't an elder movement. It was elder youth or youth elder, something like that. Right. There's no word for it, maybe, but and so that was another thing that was very helpful to me to see was the importance of the elders in the community, and also the wonderful embrace that everyone received from the black community. I think you mentioned kind of something like that a little bit earlier about how you were received there, and so we brought youthful energy, but what made it really useful was working with the elders with that energy.
Yeah.
And not only with the energy, but it also, the youth were able to do things that the elders weren't able to do, right?
Right.
Like with regards to the fight to desegregate the whole Birmingham and Montgomery and, all of those different actions, especially the youth march that happened, or the youth movement that where we saw the images of fire hoses and dogs and all this stuff, where the parents weren't able to do that because they had jobs and being evicted from houses and all these other kind of repercussions. So while they were able to provide a foundation for the youth to exist and live, the youth were able to go out and do these forms of civil disobedience, which then gained massive media attention, which then helped to push forward the civil rights movement. So like you mentioned, it's a fusion of the generations, right? Intergenerational movements where people are supporting each other with their skill sets that they have. And even today, that can be seen very relevant in organizing across generational lines, where you have the youth that are tech savvy and they can do everything and make all the images and all this other kind of stuff. But you have the elders that have the history and knowledge of forming nonviolent movements and the readings and the historical context and the lessons learned that they can share with them. Boycotts, right? Strikes, all that kind of stuff.
Which again goes back to the idea of the importance of history, the other history, I guess, which is the history of mass demonstrations against segregation that have been going on for decades and decades. Let me just say that I don't want to give anyone the impression that the youth just brought energy. When I think of people like John Lewis, for example, there's a lot of heavy-duty, analytical, brilliant thinking going on among the youth.
Oh, yeah.
Especially, I would say, with the SNCC organizers, so Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, and Elizabeth Bettina Martinez. It was another interesting example of crossover work that was very brave and courageous.
Yeah, and like even people like I went to the James Lawson Institute this last year in LA, which was a gift in itself, but I got a chance to learn from Mary King, who was involved, and she was quite young during that movement as the secretary for SNCC, I believe. And then Dr. King, it depends on what your definition of youth is, right? I mean, most people think about youth as below 30 or whatever, and Dr. King was like right on that cusp with regards to his age when he was starting in the movement and towards the end when he was murdered. So just the sheer level of knowledge and the ability of critical thinking and analysis and engagement amongst all of those groups are unbelievable.
Yeah. And may I also mention another elder, a person who was young and kind of mid-elder, mid-youth, Ella Baker. Ella Baker was the brilliant, really pivotal mind, I emphasize the mind there, of that is at the foundation of the creation of SNCC, at least as I understand it. So Ella Baker, then also people like Fannie Lou Hamer from Mississippi. I mean, there were some amazing women who were, talk about strong and resilient and thoughtful. They were, whether they had educations or didn't have it, they were all articulate and really better analysts of what was going on than my professors in college were.
Yeah. So John, I wanted to ask you about nonviolence. Was being an ally with SNCC your first exposure to nonviolence?
Yes, because that was not something the SDS, to the best of my knowledge, ever focused on. The SDS was not urging violence, but it didn't have a whole backup way of thinking that was the opposite of violence, which is nonviolence. So, we were given some very quick training in Atlanta before we went further south. It was my first experience with it, and I must say, I thought it was very positive, both in a tactical sense, but also in dare I say, a spiritual sense for myself.
Mm.
I mean, because to not engage in violence really freed me, I think freed other people as well, from that terrible burden. You were talking about the burdens that people carry. So, to be violent, well, that's another way of doing things, but it brings a lot of burden with it. So just trying to avoid getting injured was important, but not being violent in return really freed us. It freed me. I don't want to speak for others. There was one event that I remember, and we were walking, marching down a residential street in Montgomery. It was a very, very hot day, humid, typical summer in the South, and people had been yelling they were going to kill us and so forth and so on. And most of the people, all the people doing that yelling happened to be white. And at one point, as we were walking down the street, a door opened, and I must admit, my first thought was, well, I hope a shotgun doesn't come poking through that open door. No, it was a white woman with a jug of ice water that she offered to us. Now, she had a lot of guts. I mean, that's her neighborhood. We were walking through it, but it was her neighborhood. But that also was a good lesson for me. I mean, it's not like I went down south with any animosity about any group, but yeah, one is Fats Waller, the great satirist and composer, said a long time ago, one never knows, do one. He was kind of being ironic there. And not falling into the trap of predicting how people are going to act based on what they